The articles of impeachment against the president have finally been delivered to the U.S. Senate. What happens next? House Judiciary member Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner will tell us. And a book by a high-ranking cardinal and a retired pope defending celibacy made headlines all over the world this week. Why all the fuss? The National Catholic Register's Edward PENTIN reports from Rome. Finally, what can we expect from this upcoming papal summary of the Amazon Synod? And what is the proper role of a Pope Emeritus? The Papal Posse, Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, are here with in-depth analysis. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An amazing show for you tonight. Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, Edward PENTIN, Robert Royal, and Father Gerald Murray are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Keep it clean. Lots to cover this evening. But first, some news from the world over. On Wednesday, after weeks of delay, the articles of impeachment against President Trump were delivered to the U.S. Senate in dramatic fashion. The articles were processed across the U.S. Capitol by the House clerk, flanked by 7 impeachment managers appointed by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, among them Congressman Adam Schiff and Jerrold Nadler. This sets the stage for only the 3rd trial in U.S. history to consider the removal of a sitting president. Joining me now to help us unpack what happens next and how all of this might end up is a manager from the last impeachment trial, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner. Congressman, thank you for being here. Now, you prepared the opening remarks for the Clinton impeachment 21 years ago and were one of the 3 Republican impeachment managers for the Clinton case. Now, the articles of impeachment have finally been handed over by Speaker Pelosi. What can we expect now?
Well, the House managers or prosecutors have got 24 hours to present their case against President Trump. Then President Trump has 24 hours to rebut and to present a defense. Then for 16 hours, the senators can ask written questions through the Chief Justice, which either the managers or the defense team can answer. Then we get to what happens next. I would imagine there would be a motion to dismiss the charges after the first 62 hours or so, and that will be about 2 weeks from now. If the charges are dismissed, that's the end of it. If either charge is not dismissed, then they will go to the next phase of the trial, and there will be a debate on witnesses, and if they decide to have witnesses, who should be called. I believe that Senator Cruz has got this spot on in saying that there ought to be an equal number of witnesses from each side. That was allowed in the Clinton trial. We as managers had 3 witnesses we could call. We chose them. The Clinton team had 3 witnesses they could call. They chose them, but it was not live testimony in the well of the Senate. These were depositions that were videotaped. The senators excerpted them and told each side which parts they could use. So there was kind of censorship by the Senate on what could be presented from those depositions.
Now, Congressman Sensenbrenner, you mentioned the Clinton model, and we've heard Leader McConnell over and over mention that we will use the Clinton impeachment trial as the model here. What will be allowed and the process will follow. Now, I am being told, and this is, I've spoken to a number of senators as well as congresspeople, that in the initial resolution, there is no motion to dismiss so far. Was that part of the Clinton model, where there was a motion to dismiss the charges at the start of the trial?
Yes, there was, and after the initial presentations and Q&A, Senator Byrd of West Virginia moved to dismiss the 2 charges. They were voted down. So we ended up getting the witnesses, and then There was another presentation for both sides, and then the Senate went into closed session and debated it, and then both sides were summoned back, and the senators voted. And of course, Clinton was found not guilty of both charges.
Now, Speaker Pelosi is talking about new evidence that has come forward. Now, she's used this to justify her delay in handing the articles off to the Senate a month later. She's referring to last Tuesday, when it was announced that phone records and other documents provided by a Florida businessman, Lev Parnas, an associate of Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, would be included in the case against President Trump. Now, Parnas is facing federal charges. In fact, he's out on bail, giving interviews and things. The notes allegedly show that Parnas and Giuliani's mission were to get Ukrainian President Zelensky to announce that they were initiating a case against Biden, investigating Joe Biden. How important is this new evidence? Is this a smoking gun, in your opinion?
Well, it's not a smoking gun, and I don't think there's even any ammunition in the gun. If Pelosi wanted to wait for new evidence to come up, she should not have rushed through the articles of impeachment through the House before Christmas. She should have waited and done it later, as a number of us suggested. You know, I think that the articles of impeachment are kind of like an indictment, and if they want to put new evidence in, the House ought to vote new articles of impeachment and send them over there as an amendment. Now, of course, this is going to slow things down, and I don't think the Senate's going to want to do that.
We're looking at video of Nancy Pelosi, and she's signing. She made great ceremony of signing the articles of impeachment, and there was laughter, and she handed pens to everybody. Does this conflict with the idea that this is a solemn occasion?
Absolutely, it does. You know, they're all cheering, maybe sometimes not so publicly, the fact that they've been doing what they wanted to do ever since the 2016 election, you know, which was to impeach Donald Trump. Now, he's not going to be removed from office. I think everybody knows this. So this shows that this is neither legal, you know, nor relating to the separation of powers between the president and the Congress, but it's all political. And it's political because they think they will damage him in the 2020 election. Last Tuesday, we had a rally in Milwaukee where both Trump and Pence spoke. And the place was packed to the gills. The cheering was raising the roof. People brought air horns, and in the hour and a half the president spoke, essentially ran out of air for the air horns. And what this has done, you know, is really energized the pro-Trump base. And they're angry, they're mad at the Democrats, and they are not only going to turn out to vote, but they're going to drag maybe less engaged and low-intensity voters out to vote with them. This has been a huge overreach by the Democrats and Pelosi, and a huge backfire.
Now, there's also a GAO report, which broke this week, that claims the president broke the law by withholding these funds from Ukraine. Pelosi says the president broke the law, and the Senate must investigate this. But didn't Obama and Clinton also break similar laws? Weren't they called out by the GAO in the past?
Well, I don't think any of these presidents broke the law. What the Anti-Impoundment Act says is that when the fiscal year comes to an end every September 30th, if the president does not appropriate and pay money that has been approved by Congress, then he has violated the law. The release of the money to Ukraine ended up being on September 11th, so it was before the end of the fiscal year and no violation of the Anti-Impoundment Act. You know, again, this is Pelosi and company manufacturing a crime and using the mainstream media to try to get everybody to believe the president committed a criminal act. He did not.
Okay. As you know, today we saw Chief Justice Roberts swearing all the senators in. Adam Schiff took to the Senate well to read the articles of impeachment. I'm going to show you a little bit of that.
Mr. President, the managers on the part of the House of Representatives are present and ready to present the articles of impeachment. which have been preferred by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
How critical is it, Congressman Sensenbrenner, that Schiff have the first word here without response from the president's team? Does that turn minds and hearts of the viewing public and potential voters?
Well, Schiff and Nadler didn't give the president a word in edgewise during what was before their committees. And I don't think that anybody's mind was turned because it was such a kangaroo court. And the President of the United States has due process rights, just like every other American citizen has. And they did not afford him those rights, which are guaranteed by the Constitution. That being said, the President will have his day probably at the end of next week or the first part of the week following the 24 hours. The prosecution in any trial or the plaintiff in a civil trial always has the first word. They have to prove their case to the satisfaction of the deciders of fact and law, which in this case are the 100 United States senators. Now, I was watching TV when that all happened, and I don't know how Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are going to be able to do impartial justice based upon what they said on the campaign trail. But they're going to have to sit there and listen to the president's defense. And I hope that the mainstream media asks them to respond to the points that the president's counsel makes.
Now, you argued the Clinton impeachment for 5 weeks. How long do you think this impeachment could go, and how critical is the viewing audience at home?
Well, the viewing audience is going to go down after the first few days of this. It did during the Clinton impeachment trial. And, you know, again, there was a gap between the first round of presentations and questions while those depositions were being done. And then it started up back again when the excerpted videotaped depositions, and it was just part of them, not all of them, were reviewed by the Senate, and the managers and Clinton's counsel commented on them. Now, if this ends if the Senate decides to call no witnesses, I would guess it would end maybe by Valentine's Day. However, if they decide to call witnesses who were on the president's staff, the president is going to impose executive privilege, which he has, and that's going to have to be decided either in court or by the Senate. And the concern I have is that Article 2 of the impeachment articles basically say the president committed an impeachable offense by going to court to resolve that question. Now, every president since George Washington has done that. And what this will do, number one, is completely blow apart the separation of powers, which is an important way of preventing tyranny by any branch of government, including Congress, I would add, but also would weaken the presidency in such a manner that any president who decided to use his constitutional right to go to court will have per se been committing an impeachable offense. That is a very bad precedent. And let's get beyond Donald Trump. Let's talk about future presidents, some of whom will be Democrats. And, do they really want that if a Republican Congress ends up subpoenaing executive branch officials, those that work in the White House, to come and testify about confidential conversations they thought they had with the president himself or his chief of staff? This is just an awful precedent and, result in more impeachments, more star chambers, more kangaroo courts, and more division of the American people, like this impeachment has done.
Yeah, no, the weaponization of all of this, of the impeachment process, I just fear we're going to have every president that comes forward, the opposing party, should they be in power, will drag him through an impeachment investigation and trial. And if they have the votes, they'll do what we saw here. They'll force it through. The people be damned. Very quickly, Congressman Sensenbrenner, we saw the president sign a major pact this week between China and the United States a big trade deal, certainly important to people in your region of the United States, farmers. Were you concerned that human rights, religious rights, really haven't been raised in these conversations, despite the concessions the president has gotten on intellectual rights and taking over of corporations, et cetera? Is that a missing link here?
Well, it probably does not have to do with trade and tariffs. The Chinese are terrible abusers of religious and human rights. Tibet is one example. The Muslim Uyghurs in the western part of China, are another example. And, obviously what has happened since Deng Xiaoping opened up China about 30 years ago is that the hold of the Chinese Communist Party over the 1.5 billion people in Red China has not been relaxed whatsoever.
Right.
And the only religion that they favor is religion that is run by the state. And we Catholics certainly can see that with the so-called patriotic church, where now the Vatican, wrongly in my opinion, has decided to have the Chinese Communist Party, which is atheist by nature, nominate bishops for the Pope to approve. And that's wrong, too, and that ought to be stopped by whatever international pressure can be put on.
Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, I wish we had another hour. Thank you for the update, for your insight. We'll be checking in with you in the days ahead.
I'm here.
All right, my friend. Thank you. Edward Pentin is up next, but first, some more news to share with you. Controversy erupted this week over a new book-length defense of priestly celibacy. Head of the Vatican's liturgy office, Cardinal Robert Sarah, collaborated with Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI on a book titled From the Depths of Our Hearts. It features their thoughts on the necessity of a celibate priesthood. The book is released at a time when the current pope is considering allowing married priests in the Amazon region, causing questions to arise about the proper role of a retired pope. Joining me now with analysis of the controversy and how it came to be, as well as a look ahead at Pope Francis's plans for 2020, is the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register, Ed Pentin, who joins us from Rome. Ed, thanks for being here. At first, it appeared that this new book was co-authored by Benedict and Cardinal Sarah. Now, the Cardinal approached Benedict about writing a text on the priesthood. Benedict sent him a long text last October. Sarah thought it was too long for an article, so they decided to turn it into a book. Why has this book gotten such a ferocious reaction in Rome when these excerpts were released this week?
Well, the key issue here, I think, Raymond, is the timing of it. It's coming just before the publication of Pope Francis's post-synodal apostolic exhortation on the Amazon Synod last year. And the sense is that this book interferes with that in the sense that it's very much upholding the mandatory rule for celibacy of priests, and that the apostolic exhortation is likely to veer away from that. It's going to probably allow for exceptions in the Amazon, to allow permanent deacons to become married, and that would be what critics say would be letting in or weakening the mandatory celibacy rule universally for the universal church.
Well,
and so there's a sense of a clash here and an interference.
But Ed, I guess my biggest question is this. If Benedict and Sarah are in agreement on the issue of celibacy for priests, as the Vatican insists they are with Pope Francis, what's the issue? The Vatican went through great efforts this week to say, hold on, Pope Francis believes in the celibacy of the priesthood and has reiterated it over and over again. So why is this such a big deal?
Well, the big deal is that it's the exceptions. The Cardinal Sarah and Benedict XVI opposed the idea of having exceptions to this in terms of allowing it to solve the issue of the shortage of priests, whereas Pope Francis is, although he upholds the celibacy rule very strongly, he is open and he has expressed openness to having it studied, which in a sense implicitly means that he's actually open to these exceptions, possibly, if the Synod came to that conclusion, which it did. And so there is a difference of opinion. Yes, they both are very want to keep the rule, but at the same time, they have this difference on whether these exceptions should be made.
Now, the papal secretary, Archbishop Georg Ganswein, who is both the secretary to Benedict XVI as well as the secretary to the papal household of Pope Francis, okay, he issued a clarification. about the former Pope's participation, going so far as requesting that Benedict's name be taken off the book. Okay? What is going on here? And why does there seem to be difficulty in getting the story straight about the publication of this book? What are you hearing?
Well, I think what seems to have been the case is that I think this was perhaps a step too far for Pope Francis, and that he really didn't want this interference. I don't believe he knew this book was coming. It doesn't seem as though he did. And when he heard about it, I think he seems to have got pretty angry and put pressure on, this is what it seems to be and what I've heard from different sources, put pressure on Archbishop Genswein, who then probably spoke to Pope Benedict and Benedict XVI and said to him, you know, you pledged to be silent. And perhaps you've gone a step too far with this, and they sort of backtracked and walked it back. That seems to have been what happened. And then, of course, with Cardinal Sarah hearing that from Benedict, he would have probably gone along with that as well.
Yeah, well, you know, I heard the same thing, Ed, from a number of sources in Rome, that pressure had been applied onto Benedict, and that the Pope himself, Pope Francis, had been alerted to this book, and it took him by surprise as well. Now, I thought Pope Francis was open to dialogue, though. Why should this be a problem? It's just another voice here in the mix. Is that really such a threat?
Well, it seems to be that what we've heard from Cardinal Claudio Humes, who was the general relator for the synod. He wrote a letter to bishops this week, saying, basically a confidential letter to bishops, which we got a copy of, saying that this issue, the document is coming at the end of the month or early February. So in other words, the apostolic exhortation seems to have been published already. So this book sort of came at the wrong time for Pope Francis, if, as seems very likely, he's gone along with what the Synod proposed, which was to allow these exceptions in the Amazon region.
There was a lot of reportage that Pope Benedict didn't actually agree to the publication of this book, and that somehow Cardinal Sarah released this without any permission or involvement of Pope Benedict. He pulled a Swiftie here. But Cardinal Sarah released a letter from Benedict where he writes on November 25th, after reading the manuscript, which he submitted to Sarah, Sarah edited and sent back to him, he said that he has his great satisfaction concerning the sections prepared in common. For my part, Benedict writes, the text can be published in the form which you have planned. Now, they claim that Benedict didn't even review the cover here, but that reportage also is wrong, isn't it, Ed?
Yes. Well, I heard from Nicholas Diat, who is Cardinal Sarah's biographer and helped and wrote the foreword to this book, that in fact Cardinal Sarah had been showed to Benedict XVI the cover and the title on December the 3rd, and that Benedict obviously approved it. And so all this talk about Benedict not knowing the exact contents or the exact presentation of this book seems to not be true, because at least from Cardinal Sarah's account, it seems quite clear that he was given plenty of details and plenty of notification, and shown the book, the draft of the book itself, as recently as December. And so to say that he didn't know about it seems very far-fetched, I think, to many people.
We've been seeing a lot of Benedict, Ed, in the media lately. Now, you reported on a recent documentary that featured Benedict XVI, produced by Bavarian State Television, and in it, Archbishop Genswein offers most of the commentary in the film, which makes no effort to hide the aged former Pope's condition. What was the purpose of this documentary, which incidentally aired before this book controversy?
Yes, well, I think it was really just to give an idea of what Benedict's life is like in the Vatican. I don't know if there was any particular motives other than that. But it is interesting that Archbishop Genswein does appear mostly in it. I think Benedict is seen to be very frail. You can hardly hear him speak. In fact, he admits, he used to have what he called a big mouth, but now he can't speak anymore. And so this was quite revealing about that. And whether that was the intention of the documentary, I don't think so. I think it was just really to give a clear impression of what his life is like there.
We're going to get more into this whole book controversy with the papal posse in a moment, but I need to move on to something else. Pope Francis delivered his customary address to the Holy See diplomatic corps this week. It was mostly a look back at the past year, but he did mention hotspots in Iran, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he talked about the Synod and using it as a diplomatic tool. What might have people missed in this address, Ed?
Well, yes. I mean, he talked also about what the key issues which are coming up this year, which is, or key events rather, that he's hosting. He's talking about this global educational pact in May, which is concerning some people because they feel that it's very sort of a secular sort of idea. It doesn't really talk about the uniqueness and truth of Christ. It talks more about common values and fraternity and these issues, which have become sort of the hallmark of this pontificate in many ways. That it's become a lot of talk about that, rather than the uniqueness and truth of Christ in explicitly at any rate. So he talks about that. He talks about also different hotspots, as you say, in the world. But yeah, it's very much emphasizing that, but also. He talks about the UN, he talks about multilateralism, He talks about reform in that and trying to bring nations together
and he
in
mentioned
a more
that
effective way and perhaps reforming the UN.
Yeah, there's also that historic announcement he made, the first woman to be appointed as an undersecretary in the Secretariat of State. Now, this is a fulfillment of one of his promises in recent years, Pope Francis's. Tell us about this Francesca Di Giovanni. She is a former attorney who will coordinate the Holy See's relationships with, among other groups, the UN.
Yes, that's right. And she's worked in the Secretariat for 27 years in the Secretariat of State. But this is the first time a woman has been put into a sort of managerial role like this. So it is quite significant. And also, the previous Undersecretary for this position, I believe, was Cardinal Parolin now. So it's a significant position. It has quite a lot of influence. The previous Undersecretary was very much a lead in the China agreement. At least he was there to sign it on behalf of the Holy See. Wow. So it does carry a lot of weight, and it is quite a significant decision. Yeah.
Before I let you go, what are you hearing about the Pope's major goals and initiatives for 2020? What do you think he will be focused on? I mean, beyond this outreach, it seems, to other faiths, Islam, building on bridges of humanity, which we heard him talk about at the end of the year and as part of this speech. What else should we be on the lookout for?
Yes, well, he has another big sort of event coming up in March, which is called the Economy of Francesco, where he's going to bring together lots of business people and entrepreneurs, many of them young entrepreneurs, to talk about his vision of economics and how to help bring a sort of a more inclusive economics and more ethical one. That's going to take place in Assisi. One of the big events, I think, this year is going to be when he publishes the new constitution for the Roman Curia, Predicate Evangelium, which is this. It's been in the draft. It's been in the works for a long time, and people are going to be very interested to see what exactly happens with that. It's going to be, I think, if the draft comes through as a final copy, then it will be quite controversial because it places evangelization above doctrine in many ways, and changes the whole sort of model of authority for the Curia, which will be quite significant. So that's going to be a major event as well. Wow. Then, of course, the Pope will be traveling quite a lot. We don't know exactly where because nothing's been confirmed, but he could go to South Sudan with the Archbishop of Canterbury. He could also go to other places like Indonesia, Malaysia, and possibly Hungary for an international Eucharistic Congress at the end of the year.
And we'll be looking for that McCarrick report, which I know is about to drop any day now, and the reforms of the Vatican Bank, which we've been hearing so much about and heard a lot about in the last year. Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent from the National Catholic Register, thank you as always for being here. As I just discussed, the controversy over this new book on priestly celibacy by Cardinal Sarah and Pope Emeritus Benedict bears a closer look. Joining me now with analysis of what really is uncharted territory, the proper role of a retired pope in public life, plus the soon-to-be-released Apostolic Exhortation on the Amazon Synod, is the Papal Posse. Editor-in-Chief of the CatholicThing.org, Robert Royal, is here with me on set, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, joins us from his hometown. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Happy New Year. I want to begin with Pope Emeritus Benedict. Now, this is not the first time he's issued a public statement. He issued a statement on the sex abuse crisis last year. He's written introductions and homilies and eulogies that have been read aloud. But this book has inspired so much discussion about the proper role of a retired pope. Father and Bob, how do you see the role of Pope Emeritus, and has Benedict overstepped his authority? Robert Royal.
Well, I wouldn't think so. I think that in this case, and in a couple of others perhaps, particularly the sex abuse case, there are certain elements that he tries to bring forward into the public discussion that both he and Sarah in this particular case say it would be, they would be wrong to stay silent. I mean, these are very large issues. And I would say on this matter of priestly celibacy, which somehow is inserted in the midst of a synod which is on environmentalism.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to deal with the question of should there be an exception in the Amazon, well, that should have been dealt with in maybe a group of bishops or bishops' conferences meeting in South America. This was brought to Rome and made into an international case, and I think people quite rightly, and probably Sarah and Benedict, view the fact that that was raised to such an international level. They view this as portending some larger change than merely, you know, a difficult circumstance in the jungles of the Amazon.
Yeah.
So, look, you could argue it, I suppose, the other way, but it seems to me that this was a big enough case that they had to say something.
Father Jerry, as Bob mentioned, this was all composed in September and October, just before and during this synod is when they were editing this document. Now, at the time, when Pope Benedict retired, which, I'll be full disclosure, I thought was a bad idea at the time, you said he should return to Joseph Ratzinger. He should have been cardinal and maybe change the garment. Have you revised your idea of what he should be, how he should act, and the title he should command in retirement?
Well, my opinion before it was announced that he would be called Pope Emeritus, or just simultaneous to that, I said, well, I really think it should be back called Cardinal Ratzinger. I was not happy that he was wearing a white cassock because that's the prerogative and privilege of the Roman pontiff, and he's no longer the Roman pontiff. So that was my advice at the time. It was obviously not taken, so therefore the reality we're facing is that he does use the title Pope Emeritus, he continues to use the title Benedict XVI, and he does continue to wear the white cassock, which is a symbol of the papal office. So he is a retired pope, but he is a retired bishop who continues in his teaching role as a bishop to express profound theological reasons why celibacy should not be cast aside. And as Bob was saying, he views this, along with Cardinal Sarah, as a moment when silence is not possible because the great good of the church demands that the leadership, the bishops, really come to the defense of what the church has done right from the beginning, which is take the Lord's word seriously. Those who leave, you know, wife and children for my sake are in fact blessed in the sight of God and are doing something very good.
There was also, and we've heard it this week, the critique that Benedict promised to remain hidden from the world after retirement, and his critics claim he's broken that promise. Is that a licit critique, Robert Royal?
Well, look, if he were promiscuous in the way he would be talking about things, kibitzing over everything that the Pope does, yes, I think that would be improper. But he's not doing that. He's certainly allowing the Pope to govern the church the way he thinks the day-to-day governance ought to be done. What we're talking about here, as Father rightly said, is a profound theological question. And if you read the book, this is not really a polemical book, other than a few sentences here and there.
It's historical and theological,
Yeah. I mean,
which we're going to preview in a moment.
It reads very much, if our viewers have read the 3 volumes on Jesus of Nazareth that Benedict published while he was still sitting Pope, It reads very much like that. It's a close look at Scripture. It's a drawing out of the lessons that are there. And the reasons why, in this particular case, that celibacy has played such an important role in the definition of what a priest is. And the kind of crisis that exists in the priesthood, they talk about this a great deal. It isn't just that question.
Right. We're going to get to that. Father Jerry, as soon as this controversy began, Austin Ivory, Pope Francis's biographer, and others decried Benedict's involvement, calling it inappropriate. He tweeted, particularly Ivory, that because of the Pope's poor health, he'd been manipulated. This is the tweet. Reports on Emeritus Pope's condition these past months concur. He is conscious, but for barely half an hour at a time. Yet he has insisted on loyalty. If he is giving views that undermine Francis, it means he's being manipulated by the usual unscrupulous courtiers. Hashtag elder abuse. Well, at least he didn't ascribe malicious intent there. But as Edward recounted earlier, this collaboration between Cardinal Sarah and Benedict, this has been going on with seeming full knowledge. Do you think the Pope Emeritus was manipulated?
He wasn't manipulated at all. In fact, that's just a political technique to delegitimize the text. No, I've read the book. It is profound. It is a continuation, as Bob said, of the reflections the Pope made in his 3 books on Jesus of Nazareth. No, the idea that this is a man who doesn't know what's going on and somebody put words in his mouth. No, even Archbishop Genschwein said that the Pope's, Benedict's contribution is 100% Benedict. No, there is nothing in this that would indicate a manipulation. It is sad that people who think that the defense of celibacy is undermining Pope Francis would take that tact. The Pope Francis himself has defended celibacy. This is, very upsetting when people are trying to pit one pope against another. This is not what's going on here. These are 2 bishops concerned with some radical ideas that were presented at the synod. These radical ideas have been around a long time, by the way. The idea that celibacy was invented by the church in order to save, the property from priests' descendants, and it's a disregard of the value of sexuality and all the rest. This is all nonsense.
Well,
celibacy is to live as Christ lived.
And Pope Francis has insisted and begged for dialogue. He said he wanted to hear all voices. He likes that clash. So what's wrong with a pope, a former pope, writing his little reflections, theological reflections? Why is this so dangerous? Robert Royal, why have the supporters of this vision of the priesthood, why have they taken such umbrage at a retired theologian at 93 writing a few thoughts on celibacy?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and speculate here,
Okay.
Raymond, since you're provoking me to do this.
Oh, well, that's what I do.
I think that they know that they're on very unsteady ground here. There have been some arguments made that if what the Holy Father is really intending to do with the post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which is the formal document that comes out after a synod, if what he's going to do is will agree with his argument that he quotes Paul VI, I would rather die than abandon priestly celibacy. If that is what he's going to do, then there's no problem. But I think it's quite clear that people already sense that there is going to be a clash between these 2 visions of what's going on. And look, if they were confident that their point of view was solid and it was just a development rather than a departure from what the constant teaching has been, I don't think there would have been this nasty, I think that's the right word for it, blowback, this undercurrent. Father James Martin said this is a parallel magisterium. These are a couple of essays that are very carefully argued and heartfelt and whatnot. Yeah. So the fact that this is coming out at this point, yes, it does restate the teaching about priestly celibacy. But I think that the threat is not that somebody has said these things, but that their position seems to be quite weak.
You heard our report earlier with Ed Pentin, Father Jerry, where he suggested that the Pope, reportage in Rome is that the Pope was furious when he learned about this book, and that a call was made to Archbishop Ganswein. Now, some are saying Ganswein, who is the secretary of the papal household, as well as a dear friend of Pope Benedict, really his mentoree for decades, that he's trying to save Benedict here. He's protecting Benedict. particularly when he asked for Benedict's name to be taken off of this book. Your thoughts on all of this?
This part of the story is very troubling because we have a direct contradiction between what Cardinal Sarah says took place and what Archbishop Genschwein says took place. And it's hard to understand how Cardinal Sarah could not be telling the truth because he's a man of absolute integrity. He says, and he produced letters from the file that Pope Benedict, the Emeritus, sent to him, displaying that Pope Benedict knew right from the start the nature of this project. Cardinal Sarah says that, against what Genschwein had said, that Cardinal Sarah says he showed Pope Benedict the cover, the introduction, the conclusion, which were under both names, and he showed him also the two sets of texts, Cardinal Sarah's text and Pope Benedict's text. In other words, Pope Benedict saw everything before it ever went to the printers.
Right.
Archbishop Genschwein maintains that the Pope didn't realize what this was happening, that he should not be called the co-author of the intro and the conclusion. Why is he doing this? I don't know. The revelations will come out and have come out so far, corroborating one side or the other. I just have to say this. Cardinal Sarah is not a man who has any political motive to lie or to obfuscate, and everything he said so far proves to be true based on the evidence available.
Yeah, not only what he said, we've seen the letters. The letters are there. You can see Pope Benedict's hand and signed by Pope Benedict all throughout this process. So you're right, it contradicts the line we're being given. And Archbishop Genschwein asked for Benedict's name to be removed from the book. Ignatius Press in America is refusing to remove his name from the book. And curiously, on Amazon, we checked, they took Cardinal Sarah's name off the title of the book. So now it just reads, from our hearts, Pope Benedict XVI. So things may have backfired here in the ensuing days. I want to look at the book itself before we run out of time. The introduction and closing remarks are attributed to both Cardinal Sarah and Benedict XVI. Each devotes a chapter on their thoughts about the importance of priestly celibacy. Here's an excerpt from the introduction. As bishops, we are responsible for the care of all the churches. In our great desire for peace and unity, we therefore offer to all our brother bishops, priests, and the lay faithful throughout the world the benefit of our exchanges. We do this in a spirit of love for the church's unity. There's that word again. Although ideology divides, truth unites hearts. To scrutinize the doctrine of salvation can only unite the church around her divine master. We do this in a spirit of charity. To us, it appeared useful and necessary to publish this work at a moment when minds seem to have calmed down. Everyone can then complete it or critique it. The search for truth can be made only by opening the heart. Therefore, we fraternally offer these reflections to the people of God and, of course, in the spirit of filial obedience to Pope Francis. Bob, they make their intentions clear there, the fidelity to the current Pope as the final exclamation point. Does this seem to indicate an attempt to undermine Pope Francis?
Look, I read the book, and I would say there's not a sentence in that 170 some odd pages or whatever it is that strikes you as wrongly polemical. In other words, attacking somebody else the way that Sarah and Pope Benedict have been, Pope Emeritus.
Savagely attacked,
yeah, savagely
by the way.
Attacked. The fact that this immediately turned into some sort of skullduggery of manipulation, when the text itself is a very beautiful reflection. It's the kind of writing that you wish all bishops were able to produce, and theologians, because it's profound and at the same time it reaches out and touches people. So, I mean, my impression of this book is that what they're saying there is exactly what they feel. They think that what they're saying is profound. It comes out of the heart of what the church is. And I would even go further and say there's not a sentence in there that would have been regarded as controversial, even just a few years ago.
Yeah.
So the politics that are being played, I think, are more on one side than on the other. The other side is very much interested in a kind of a moral theological argument, and other people are reading this as somehow entering into papal politics.
Father Jerry, it does seem the hothouse of the moment over this Amazon exception, allowing married men to be ordained is creating the spirit of division and suspicion around this book. Here's my question, okay? Both Cardinal Sarah and Benedict XVI write, our celibacy is a witness, in other words, a martyrdom. Okay, here's my big question. Wasn't it Pope Benedict who opened the door, who allowed married men in the Episcopal Church as priests to come into the Catholic Church when he created the ordinariate? Hasn't he already created an exception?
Well, there is an exception. In fact, that goes back even to John Paul II,
Right.
When that was allowed at the beginning. But to the point of what the book says, and particularly Cardinal Sarah's contribution, I'll say this. I've read all of Cardinal Sarah's books. This is one of the most profound, heartfelt, and we could say deeply Catholic things he's ever written. Catholic in the sense of his love for the Church is such that it propels him to defend something that he himself has lived so well for 50 years. Cardinal Sarah in the book writes that it really is doubtful he would have become a priest if there had been married clergy who came to his village to preach the gospel, because he says, part of the reason I became a priest was I was inspired by these young French missionaries who gave their life to Christ and traveled all the way to his remote village to proclaim the gospel. The book actually, I think, is so important and necessary because it points out we should not make a decision about such an important institutional life of the Church based on so-called practicality and managerial convenience. This idea of, well, we need more priests in the Amazon, so let's ordain some elders in villages and they'll just say Mass, but that's about it. That's not what the priesthood is all about. As he points out in the book, the faith has survived in many parts of his country, Guinea and Africa, where the priest only visited occasionally. But when he came, the priest was clearly the presence of Christ to those people. In other words, bringing the Lord to those people, similar to how the Lord walked through the Holy Land and to the different villages. So he really goes after those he considers, we use the word neo-colonialist, people essentially from Europe telling the third worlders, you people don't really understand celibacy, you can't live it, and therefore we're going to have married clergy. He's very strong about that.
Father, for the sake of our audience at home, I can envision people I know who've asked me, what is the difference between what the Amazon Synod is pushing and Benedict XVI opening the door to married men, Episcopal priests coming into an ordinariate in the Catholic Church? They're both married men being ordained.
Right, but the one thing was an act of mercy toward those who had dedicated their life to Christ in the Episcopal Church and then decided that the Catholic Church, which is true, is the one true church. And now the church in its mercy said, well, we'll let you continue your ministry of serving the people of God. The other is to basically say celibacy is not that important. We're going to have married clergy right from the start. It overthrows all of Catholic history. Making an exception of mercy to allow people to continue to preach the gospel is a lot different than saying celibacy is not important here. We're going to ordain married men.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing.
Let me get Bob in on this. Bob, your reaction.
Yeah, I've been at all these recent synods, and one of the things that I'm struck by is when we started out with the first family synod, it was the Casper option, which was just a limited number of people who might seek to be able to receive communion even though they were divorced and remarried without having an annulment. And suddenly that began to grow, and we started to see that that was becoming sort of a universal principle. All of a sudden we're talking about valuing homosexual relationships and this sort of thing. There's a way in which these recent synods have expanded beyond the actual definitions that we see them trying to arrive at. So I think it's quite, there is an explanation for the exceptions that are made in the Eastern Church and in the Anglican ordinariate, in that these were limited openings. They did not challenge the question of celibacy. But we can see here just simply the way the previous synods have unrolled and the fears that were there during this synod. I mean, Pachamama was not an invention of us, of the journalists. It was a serious challenge to the question of idolatry. I think many people looking at this so-called opening in one place, as I said earlier, if it was just about that, it would have been better treated in South America. I think what we see is, we know what's going on in Germany right now. We know that in other places in the world, there are people who are going to begin to push about this and many other things. Ordination of women, women deaconesses, etc.
I need you both to react to this. The most striking plea for retaining mandatory celibacy, and it is a discipline in the Western Rite, comes at the end of this book, this new book Pope Benedict XVI and Cardinal Sarah have authored. It's perhaps what's making the most waves. They write, "We are living through these difficult, troubled times in distress and suffering. It was our sacred duty to recall the truth about the Catholic priesthood, and through it, the whole beauty of the Church is being called into question. The Church is not a human organization. She is a mystery. She is the mystical bride of Christ. Our priestly celibacy continually reminds the world of precisely this. It is urgent and necessary for everyone, bishops, priests, and lay people, to stop letting themselves be intimidated by the wrong-headed pleas, the theatrical productions, the diabolical lies, and the fashionable errors that try to put down priestly celibacy." Father Jerry, what are they talking about there?
Well, I think Cardinal Sarah is basically saying, and the Pope Benedict, because they both agreed to that conclusion, the Church should not surrender to the world. The world is insistent. For the world, Catholic sexual morality and the discipline of celibacy is a contradiction of their whole project. For the world, sex is about fun, pleasure, and nothing more. For the Catholic Church, sex is a sacrament in marriage. It is sacred. It is where God brings new life into the world through the cooperation of man and woman. And to renounce marriage for the sake of the kingdom, praised by our Lord directly, is something that is of great value for those who take the place of Christ. The idea, for instance, that a priest is simply a functionary who celebrates the sacraments and then returns to ordinary life, this is anathema. The priest is the living icon of Christ. He represents Jesus not simply at the altar, but in every other activity that he does. When a priest comes into a mission land and says, "I am here for no other reason than to announce to you the salvation won for us by Jesus Christ, and I'm going to do that with my whole life, and God willing, I'll die here in your presence," that is, in fact, the kind of work that is necessary for the promotion of the faith. Not this idea of, well, you know, sexual morality has changed over time. It's too hard to ask priests to not have wives. Let's go ahead and do it. If we give in on celibacy, what other thing is going to have to change because the world isn't happy with it? Has the Church been so wrong and misinterpreted God's intention for all these years? That's why this book is necessary. The Pius were diabolical, and I think that was well chosen, because we know the devil hates the Church, he hates the sacraments, he hates Catholic sexual morality. These are the things we have to defend and not make a false compromise saying, well, it's too tough these days to ask men to be celibate. Oh, no.
Bob, it's hard
where the faith is alive, the vocations are alive.
Bob, it's hard to imagine that they weren't talking about these synods when they talked about theatrical productions. I mean, what else could they be referring to vis-a-vis priestly celibacy?
Yeah, or the media circuses. They talk about that a little bit too, and I think there's a just criticism of the way
where they promote the guys who left, who are all over the media. I see them all the time trying to.
But look, I would say to viewers, read this book, because this is a relatively brief presentation of why it is that we have celibacy. And I agree with Father entirely that to take the easy path here, to concede to where the world is going, which has been a disaster, by the way, in secular terms. I mean, the family is a disaster, and sexual relations between men and women are a disaster. I think you look back to, remember John Paul II always used to say to young people, don't be content with mediocrity. And that the way, if you're having a shortage of vocations, the way you call people to this is you make it clear to them that this is a heroic enterprise that they're being called to, something that is going to be quite different than the world offers, and very few people are able to do it. And when they talk about martyrs, the term martyr is having two meanings. It means being a witness to the faith. But it also means potentially having to die or give up something quite serious for the faith. And unless the Church communicates to the world that the faith is so important that it's willing to sacrifice everything to follow Jesus Christ, well, then what is the point of the church being out there in the world anyway?
Before I let you go, we only have 2 minutes. There was a private letter leaked to the press this week from the Holy See to bishops around the world, hinting at the contents of the Pope's final word on that Amazon Synod, the Apostolic Exhortation. And it encourages bishops to read up on the Synod documents and speeches, etc. Here's my question. What do you expect, Father Jerry, very quickly from this final exhortation? And if the Pope does indeed allow ordination of elders in this limited region, can you contain it to that region? Father Jerry.
Right. Well, I expect there'll be a lot on the ecology stuff, and, that's of interest. But the real thing is, if the Pope does say that you can ordain married men in the Amazon, I predict that the following day, bishops in Germany and elsewhere are going to stand up and say, Amazon needs priests, we need priests. They're going to cite the fact they have no one in their seminaries. They have all these former ex-priests who are married out there who they want to welcome them back to serve as priests. I think this is going to be a total disaster for the church if it happens. And I say that as the word was used, catastrophe, in Cardinal Sarah and Benedict's book. We're going to be in big trouble. I hope the Pope doesn't do it because, the change in the Amazon was basically pushed forward by Europeans who are using that as a place to get what they want back at home. And I'm going to say this. True Catholicism does not cave into the spirit of the world. True Catholicism, as Bob says, is heroic, and it goes back to the roots of Christianity, to the word and example of Jesus.
Robert Royal, your reaction?
Yeah, if you look at the list of texts that the bishops are encouraged to read, there is a lot of environment and, frankly, a lot of economics and politics in there, too, because the part of the Amazon Synod was to promote this new idea of an integral human ecology that's going to also have the faith involved with the earth and economics and whatnot. I think that I've written books about environmentalism and about other similar subjects, and I think that part of it is going to be very weak. And besides, the world already does this. The world is already
what do we need
debating
the church to remind us of that? We have the UN.
Yeah, we're already debating, and the Pope laments quite often that the international order doesn't seem to do very much about either economics or about environment, and that's because there are various interests, and those various interests have to be reconciled. I think it's quite true that the part that is going to be potentially the most disastrous is if using that as those larger issues as a cover, we sneak in questions of deaconesses, we sneak in questions about ordination of married men. That's a separate debate, and it's not something to be made lightly, sort of as a side issue while you're dealing with these other questions. So I would pay careful attention to that, and I hope bishops around the world do as well.
Well, the spiritual catastrophe coming out of something like this could overwhelm any climate catastrophe that's prophesied in these pages. I wish I had more time because I wanted to talk about the great piece you wrote about the Vatican-China Accord. I'll give you 20 seconds. Where do you think it stands now?
Well,
why did the Pope not bring it up during his address to the diplomats at the Vatican?
Yeah, I wrote this piece earlier in the week, and viewers can look at it at thecatholicthing.org, our website. But I was struck by the irony that on Wednesday of last week, the Pope gave his discourse to the diplomats at the Holy See and didn't mention China, although he mentioned other hotspots around the world, Venezuela and whatnot. And the very next day, our U.S. Congress issued a report on religious repression in China that made it quite clear that there are whole communities that are being wiped out, that there's brainwashing going on, that there's organ harvesting going on, that there's pressure to rewrite the scriptures in the various religions, and not only the so-called Western religions like Judaism and Christianity, but even Buddhism and Hinduism that are more indigenous to China.
And there's only one God in all of them, Xi.
Yeah.
Really problematic. We'll leave it there.
Okay.
Great piece, though. Father Jerry, Robert Royal, thank you both for being here. And you can find both of their commentary at thecatholicthing.org. That's all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, you can follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.